Welcome back to part 2 on this tutorial about gain staging inside your DAW. In the first video we had a little look at how distortion can kind of creep into your signal path even though it doesn't look like you're clipping at the mixer channel strip level. And in this video we're going to have a little look at some of the ways we can avoid some of those pitfalls and how we can avoid some of those accidental distortions by changing up some of our metering, getting rid of the master fader and a few other little bits and bobs. So if we control click up here and customize our control bar and display, we can change what's actually set up in here. So I usually get rid of auto punch and replace, and I put pre-fade metering in, which is going to be very useful. I also customize that there so we get a bigger view of what's going on. And I'm also going to get rid of this master volume, because lots of people make the mistake that this is kind of a volume that doesn't really affect what's going on in Logic. If I just go OK a sec and bring up the mixer, this master volume, you could not be clipping at your master fader and then turn up this master volume, or the stereo out I should say, and it will actually add those 6 dB of gain, and the signal from the stereo out actually runs through this master bus, this master VCA fader, meaning that it can overdrive and clip the output of the signal even if it's not clipping at the stereo output. So this is just like the worst fader in the world, and people on laptops, etc., people when they're kind of producing or mixing, they'll often do things where they won't use the volume on their laptops themselves, on their MacBooks or whatever. They'll actually just turn this up and crank this up but still have it quiet on the headphones and stuff like this. I see this happen all the time with students. What you should do is leave that fader alone and actually get rid of it from here. So let's go back to the customized control bar and display, and let's get rid of that master volume because it is the spawn of the devil. We don't really want that there, and we can get rid of it, and then it's in here, leave it at 0, and we kind of never touch those two faders. If we need it to be louder, you need to turn up your headphone preamp or turn up the system output on your MacBook, etc. If we go to our preferences, go to Logic Pro X, go to preferences and go to display, we actually have another thing that's quite useful. So I'm going to turn this test oscillator back on for a sec, and I'm going to, in fact actually I'm going to do it on this gain plugin. And I'm going to go minus 9 dB, and in fact let's go minus 12 dB. So minus 12 dB is still quite a strong level. It's kind of what a lot of people would aim for, between minus 18 and maybe minus 6 dB when recording. But if we look at the metering here, it makes it look like our signal level is really, really weak. So we tend to kind of crank up this kind of resolution here and really try and hit hard the faders so that we get near to 0 as possible. Let's just turn that off a sec. Which can be a very, very easy thing, a very easy trap to kind of fall into. So what's a good idea to do on your home system is to go to the mixer tab in display here and change the scaling of the level meters, not from exponential, but take it back to linear, so that if we undo this again, minus 9 starts looking like a much, much, much more healthy signal, something that we're more akin to, and it makes sense kind of looking into that minus 18 dB as a recording level, up to as high as kind of minus 6 when doing gain staging for recording. But also when we're mixing and when we're doing stuff in here, this is a really good thing to change to make sure that we're not kind of chasing those high meter levels, because we are human beings and we do tend to mix with our eyes even though we shouldn't, and that's a good way to kind of get around some of that stuff. Now back to the kind of pre-fade metering. Now one of the good things that we have here, and we can see this happening, is when you click that button there, you can see that what the level of the signal is hitting the fader or hitting the input of the channel before the fader. So you can check if there's distortion in your signal chain before you're kind of hitting the fader, and having that pre-fader button just swaps the metering to the left hand side, and we can see that we're clipping by nearly 6 dB before we get to that fader. So even though it's kind of compensated, we can see that we've still got some poor gain staging going on in between the plugins, and this can be really useful for kind of troubleshooting of where our bad gain staging is. And obviously I've hit that pretty hard on this SSL channel strip here, and we can go back and we can go and undo some of those things. Or even if we've got a plugin that doesn't necessarily have a level output or some gain adjustment on it, we can just simply use, in those instances, a gain plugin either before or after, or in some cases both, to tame the signal in between processes. So we could give it a bit more headroom and a bit more resolution. If I go minus 14 dB, we can see that we've got a few dB of headroom there before it goes into the next plugin. And using a gain plugin in between processing plugins is quite a smart way to do it if your plugin that you're using doesn't have an input gain or an output gain, but still adds or takes away level as part of that signal process. The other thing that's worth kind of paying attention to is faders themselves. So we actually have a resolution on the fader of sort of minus 95 dBs is as low as it can go, and it goes up in kind of 5 dB kind of increments until it starts to scale to be something more useful around the minus 30 mark here. Now if we're trying to add 1 or 2 dB of gain when your faders are this low, it's going to be really difficult. But similarly, if we're kind of mixing with our signals coming in quite hot and we're starting up here at the 0 point, we've only got plus 6 dB to go to. So it's usually a good idea before you start mixing. I usually do something like minus 12 and I bring the fader down, so I've got some tight resolution. I can go down in small increments either downwards, or I've got quite a lot of that fader space there to go up into the mix as well. And we'll look at that in more depth in some tutorials later. But the idea of the resolution of the fader, what you actually get in terms of values here, and how this is working on an exponential, not a linear scale, is quite important to note when you're kind of setting your kind of broad levels to give you a bit of headroom. Because if you're mixing in drums and then mixing in bass, guitars, leads, vocals, synth parts, whatever you're kind of doing, if you're already coming in quite hot and you're coming in at kind of minus 6 dB with just sorting out the drums, there's only 6 dB left to fit the whole rest of your project in. So you need to kind of keep some headroom and do some sensible kind of gain staging at the mixing stage as well with the faders. And that's all I really wanted to look at in this tutorial. So that is a quick kind of recap and a quick look at some of the pitfalls of poor gain staging.